everyone. Welcome back. Um, Thanks for watching. One extremely exciting thing is that for both classes, I finally finished grading the papers, and I'm so sorry it took so long. So now I can catch up on, critical summaries and stuff. So your grades should be coming in this week. So that makes me feel good. And for your last papers, so the reason that this took so long is because I know that you're about to write another paper, and so that, is weighed more for your grade. So I wanted to make sure I gave you like a suggestion or something for next time so that you could do better. So for the last paper, it shouldn't take so long because you won't be writing another paper after that. So I don't have to think too hard about how to make your paper better. I'm just grading it, you know what I mean? So yeah, that should be good. And any other updates? Your paper proposal assignment is up for your next paper. One big change that I made was that on the syllabus, it says that your paper needs to be 6 to 8 pages, and I changed it to 4 to 6. I figured it's just too much. I don't know. I thought, okay, like you start out smaller and then you get bigger, but I don't know. I don't know that you need to write a 6 to 8 page paper, so I kind of changed my mind on that. If you want to, feel free, but it felt like a little much. So I changed that, and your paper proposals, same thing as last time. They're due on Tuesday at your scheduled class time. So be sure to turn that in, or it's a 0, which is, it's 10% of your grade. So, it's not going to make you fail, but it's not going to be good. So, and a week from today, we have a Zoom meeting. So be thinking about that and things you want to talk about, questions that you have, anything like that. All right. Any other housekeeping things? I think that's it. All right. So last week we started talking about moral philosophy, and we started with taking a specific moral problem and talking about how you would approach a specific moral problem. Now we're backing up a little bit in the sense that this week is more about moral theory. So what's the underlying theory that makes you come to certain conclusions about particular moral problems? So I think it's easier sometimes to think of something like a concrete example that we see in our everyday life, or on the news every day, and then kind of let that, okay, that's it gets you in the groove of like, okay, that would be considered a moral philosophical problem. Just kind of see in the real world, and then come back and be like, okay, so dig into the philosophy. What is the underlying moral law that we're operating under, or that you operate under? Anybody can have a different moral theory, which is part of the problem in the world, is that people think some things are bad, and other people think that those things are good because they have different underlying moral philosophies, whether they will recognize that or not. So first, you kind of have to ask the question of what morality is. What does it entail? So kind of just a basic definition is that morality consists of a body of principles that offer guidance about how one should regard and behave toward others, principles that express the moral perspective rather than the prudential or aesthetic perspectives. So it's just like, okay, this is one aspect or one perspective of things. So you have an aesthetic perspective as well as a moral perspective. It's just different sets of principles that you hold, and you can all hold them, together. So if you're trying to develop a moral theory, you want it to be universal in a sense. Not that like everyone is going to agree with it, because if that's your basis for coming up with a theory, you'll never come up with one. But just that it makes sense for everyone, and that the majority of people would, understand why your theory is the way that it is. So from the moral perspective, it seems that most people agree with two basic principles, or three basic principles. The first being that each person matters, and that it matters that each person's life goes well. The second, that no one is intrinsically more valuable than anyone else, so everyone is equal. And third, that we cannot act merely to satisfy our own interests, desires, and aims. We must respect others by taking into account how our actions affect them in a manner that reflects their equal importance. So those are three things that are pretty uncontroversial, but of course you still have people that can disagree and that will disagree. But that's kind of what I mean by universal, in a sense. Like, most people would understand those three things to be true. So you have a couple of questions to deal with. One being, what does it mean for a human life to go well? And second, meaning, what does respecting the value and equal importance of others' lives involve? So first is like, what does it mean? And second is, how do you do it, basically? So in the introduction of this chapter, you have a few different, they just kind of run by a few different theories. So one, we'll just pick out a few. One is hedonism, if you are familiar. It just means that seeking pleasure, your life is good if you seek pleasure above all else, and seek pleasure above all else, and not pain. So it looks like that was glitching out. I hope that didn't, but it may have. So pleasure is the ultimate. So this can look different. Hedonism can look different in different circumstances. So you could think of a hedonist as like a rock and roll person that just sex, drugs, and alcohol, and just goes in with any, fleeting pleasure and just chases them to the end of their life. Or you could have the same underlying moral principle, but think that you achieve it in a different way. So you could have a pretty mild version of hedonism where you just seek happiness, and you understand that you shouldn't seek happiness or pleasure that's fleeting, but that you want to grab hold of long-lasting pleasures. So friendship, relationships, doing good, things like that. You could consider that to boost your happiness and your pleasure, and that could be a version of hedonism that just looks really different. So for those two types of hedonists, you would agree that hedonism is the right moral philosophy, but the way that you achieve those ends would be totally different. So that's something to think about. An objective list theorist would be someone that thinks that a good life can be defined by an objective list of qualities. So health, happiness, freedom, fiscal freedom, things like that. that those are the things that create a good life, the good life, and so you should seek those things in order to achieve the good life. So in philosophy, we talk about the good life, and I mean, it's going to mean different things for different people, but just like a well-rounded quality life is kind of what that means. So it doesn't mean pure pleasure, and it doesn't mean like pure duty. It's kind of a combination of both. So then you have the consequentialist, which contends that the morally correct action for me must reflect the implications of my actions on my own life exactly as much as, but not more than, their impact on others. So everything that I do affects me as well as other people. The same amount that it affects me, it will affect other people. That's what a consequentialist would think. The non-consequentialist would think that there's a different way to respect the equal importance of others' lives. Respect for the equal importance of others' lives involves subjecting myself to the same rules that others should abide by. So I should act in ways that I also think others should act in relevantly similar circumstances. So I can pay more attention to myself and my loved ones, as long as I don't ignore other people's needs or cause them serious harm. So they're kind of similar but slightly different. The consequentialist is taking a more, I think, global approach and thinking like, how is this action going to affect all others? And that I should be thinking about that as much as I'm thinking how it will affect me. And the non-consequentialist, it's kind of hard to say, is saying that it's okay to focus in on your particular life and your particular people, relationships, as long as you're not ignoring, the other folks. So, the most famous version of consequentialism is utilitarianism, which we will get into with John Stuart Mill, but it basically holds that a life goes well when it contains the maximum possible amount of utility, or the most happiness that you can get. So, yeah, we'll kind of skip over that for now because we'll get into that when we get into Mill. One critique of utilitarianism is that the moral, or this is an example, the moral prohibition on killing doesn't seem to hinge upon whether killing fails to maximize happiness. So imagine maybe like John Wayne Gacy, like the famous clown killer guy. I don't know if this is true of him, but if you're a clown, then I'm sure you like pretend to be happy, but I won't choose a specific example since I don't know anything about him. But imagine a murderer that gets like ultimate pleasure from killing other people. Just because they experience more pleasure in doing a morally depraved thing should not mean that it's more morally acceptable. So, because the happiness would be increasing, they would have just like this insurmountable amount of joy from killing, and that should have no effect on whether killing is right or wrong. So that's a critique of utilitarianism. Okay, so Mill would be our token consequentialist theorist, and then Kant would be our token non-consequentialist theorist. So Kant concurs that as moral agents we must act from a principle of impartiality that recognizes the equal moral status of all rational beings, but his argument about what impartiality demands emphasizes what principles of actions we would affirm for everyone. So we'll talk about this when we get into Kant. So I shouldn't even go into it now. Okay. Then you have virtue ethics, which is what originated with Aristotle. And it's basically that the right thing to do is that which a virtuous person would do. So a person can develop into a virtuous person, but this does not involve learning a simple moral rule. So it's, I mean, he explains it a lot, so it's not as circular as it sounds, but it almost sounds like the right thing to do is to do the right thing, or to do the virtuous thing, which sounds kind of the same. But he does talk about like what he considers to be virtuous, and because he values reason and the rationality of human beings, a lot of virtue for him has to do with reason. Yeah, so according to Aristotle, a person functions well if the parts of his soul that employ reason function well. This in turn requires that a person be virtuous, so it turns out, on Aristotle's view, a person's life goes well if and only if she's virtuous. So it's like basic, but also a little hard to wrap your mind around that to be moral, you must be virtuous, because those sound like kind of the same thing, but yeah, he does explain it. We just don't have time to get into it, so. Okay, so then we have Friedrich Nietzsche, who states that pain and suffering are not morally special or particularly bad, and that we do not have strong reasons to relieve others' sufferings. So Nietzsche is, typically considered to be a nihilist, so the simplest version of nihilism is just that things don't matter. So pleasure and pain don't have significance or great significance. So Nietzsche advocates fostering the greatest individual lives akin to great works of art. So not much different than non-rational agents. So it's just interesting. Nietzsche's interesting, if you ever want to read him. All right, so those are just kind of the basic moral theories and an overview. We're going to dive into John Stuart Mill and Kant, Immanuel Kant. So they're from similar time periods. Kant came first, Mill after. Mill's from England, so it makes him a lot easier to read, especially compared to Kant, who's German, and to me, he's not super fun to read, but he's very philosophically significant and one of the most prolific philosophers out there, so very important, but not my favorite to read. So, but Mill, I feel like, was pretty straightforward, which I appreciate. So he is our token utilitarian. He's from the 1800s, and you probably know him better from politics, if you know him. He is, or was, a libertarian, and he kind of came up with his own version of libertarianism, which I'm not sure if we will talk about him. We probably will when we get to political philosophy, but we'll make a chart, and we have progressive liberalism on the far left, and then you have left libertarianism, and then you have right libertarianism, and then you have conservatism. And Mill would be right libertarianism, where he thinks that what you want government to do is to allow you to live your best life. You should want and seek the freedom to live the good life, the philosophically good life. And so it's objective in a sense, so that's why it's a little different than left libertarianism, because it's not just like you should have the freedom to do literally anything you want, absolutely anything. He has a little bit more strict standards for that. But the underlying moral philosophy of his political philosophy is utilitarianism. So it all kind of fits together, which is what you want your philosophies to inform your other philosophies. You know what I mean? You don't want them to be inconsistent. So anyways, he's very interesting. I enjoyed reading him because he's pretty straightforward. So, the important thing for moral philosophy is that there be some one fundamental principle or law at the root of it. So, and I mean, also moral philosophers can disagree with that. You could think that there could be multiple laws, but for both Mill and Kant, they're seeking to find the one fundamental principle and then apply it however it needs to be applied. So for Mill, the requirements for this one principle are that it helps decide between various principles when they conflict, and that it be self-evident. So it should be like, yeah, that makes sense. You can come to it on your own. So the one that he is proposing is the utilitarian or happiness theory. And, well, I'll give an example as we go. So, this is kind of the definition of the greatest happiness principle. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And happiness is intended pleasure in the absence of pain. Unhappiness would be pain in the privation of pleasure. So, basically, for Mill, the greatest happiness principle is that things are morally right as they promote happiness. Which kind of sounds like hedonism in a sense. It's not, because he's not saying like each person seek their own pleasure above all else. He's saying the greatest amount of happiness, the greatest amount of pleasure. So that includes everyone else. The hedonist would be more concerned with themselves seeking pleasure. The utilitarian is concerned with the world seeking happiness. So he says that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends. So in both Mill and Kant, you get the distinction between means and ends. And I'm sure you've heard that in just like, I don't know, typical conversation of like, yeah, I just see that as a means to an end. Like if you want this one particular job, but you have to start out at a lower position to finally get a promotion to that job that you really want, then you might say, yeah, this job is just a means to an end to get to that job promotion that you really want. And you probably don't mean it in the strictest sense of means versus ends. You probably just mean, oh, that's my way to get there. But in the philosophical sense, an end would be like the thing that your life, the ultimate thing that your life is working towards. And the means would be everything else. So for Kant, he's really clear about this, that human beings are ends in themselves. Everything else is a means. For Mill, pleasure and freedom from pain are ends. And so we as humans seek those ends. So, yeah. And he brings up Epicureans, who were kind of the first like hedonists that like Epicurus was a philosopher, an ancient philosopher that was big on drink and food and just eating your fill licking the plate of life clean, if you will. And I mean, they don't have like the reputation of being like philosophically geniuses. Not to say that they're not, but that's just not really the reputation they have. So he's trying to say what he is advocating for is different than this. So he says that there is no known Epicurean theory of life which does not assign to the pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments a much higher value as pleasures than those of mere sensation. So for Mill, pleasures of the intellect, feelings, imagination, moral sentiments, those have higher value than just pleasure as sensation, which is what the Epicureans were seeking. So sex, wine, alcohol, I don't know if they did drugs back then, but if it was there, they probably did them. Those are all just pure sensation, and that's why it's considered pleasure. For Mill, this use of the word pleasure has more depth to it and has more weight. It's not just sensation, it's pleasures of the intellect. So try not to think of pleasure for Mill as just like what makes you feel good, because it's not really what he's saying. It's more like happiness overall, which he would say comes from pleasures of the intellect, feelings, imagination, moral sentiments. So they have a higher value than pleasures of sensation, which is what makes him politically a right libertarian instead of a left libertarian. He assigns value to certain pleasures over others. Which his I mean, we'll get into this when we get into politics, but his political view is like not really addressed in at least modern American politics. It's kind of just like, oh, you're either left or you're right, or maybe you're libertarian. But libertarian, how we know it, is mostly left libertarian. So his version is a little more complex, and yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so he says, of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is a more desirable pleasure. Yeah. So if people typically choose one pleasure over the other, then that's the more desirable pleasure, which is a little counterintuitive because, well, maybe if people had time to really think about it, but on the surface, it's like if I think, do you want candy or do you want to read philosophy? It's like, I don't know. Most people would say candy, I think, but that doesn't mean that that's the higher pleasure. But I guess if you were given more time to think about it, it's a little more weightier decision, people would come to the better conclusion. Anyways, that just got me thinking for a second. Okay, so then he says that I've dwelt on this point as being a necessary part of a perfectly just conception of utility or happiness, considered as the directive rule of human conduct. But it is by no means an indispensable condition to the acceptance of the utilitarian standard, for that standard is not the agent's own greatest happiness, but the greatest amount of happiness altogether. So this is why it's consequentialist theory, because you're not concerned primarily with your own personal happiness. You're not doing everything you can to get your own personal happiness, but it's rather that every moral decision that you make, you're considering, is this the greatest happiness for everyone? So, I'm sure you've heard like this train example. I'll try and set it up. Imagine there's a train coming, and it has to split into one this way or this way. And let's say this way, there's someone lying on the tracks, and they're tied. You don't have time to stop the train. You're gonna run over them if you turn this way, or you turn this way, and there's 5 people on the track. So for the utilitarian, they would say, well, you kill the one person, because there's 5 versus 1. Calculate it. You should kill the 1. Now, make this a little more complicated. Imagine that you're the person pulling the lever, and that person, that's the one person, is your son. So it's either you kill your son or you kill 5 people. The utilitarian would still say you should kill the one person, no matter who that person is, because they're not as concerned with your own personal happiness, your own personal life. It's about how do we calculate the maximum amount of utility. And I'm not sure your intuitions on that. I think people would have different ones. But to kill your own son, like, that's hard. Clearly. That's why it's, a famous problem. But yeah, and then you could also imagine, there's so many different variations of this, but imagine, okay, it's your son this way, or you kill 1,000 people this way. Like, maybe the train goes off a cliff. Does that change? If you would have said that you wouldn't kill your son, does that change that now? That sort of thing. It sucks that that's even a problem. It sucks that morality is so hard, is what I mean by that. That, like, every moral decision we make is complex in some way. Like, even the example that the intro gave of, like, stealing someone's cigarettes to make them stop smoking. That's complex. That has a few different layers. If it's just simply wrong to steal, and if you're like Kant and you're more of like a duty person, like you do the right thing no matter what, then you would say, no, you don't steal. But if you're trying to calculate, okay, what's going to be the consequence of this? Is the consequence going to outweigh this morally, not great thing that I'm about to do? Yeah. Anyway, something to think about. Okay. So, according to utilitarians, the end of human action is also the standard of morality. So, the end of human action being pleasure. So, the standard of morality is also pleasure, or happiness, or however you want to define it or say it. So the rest of his paper is kind of addressing objections. So the first one is that an objector might say, happiness in any form cannot be the rational purpose of human life and action because in the first place, it's unattainable. So we can't even get to ultimate happiness. So how is it going to be a good standard for morality if we can't even get there? But Mill says that even if that were true, that happiness were not attainable, at least the absence or the lessening of pain is attainable in some way. So you would choose that which decreases pain. That's kind of an easy way to get out of it, but you could also just think that that's not true, that happiness is attainable. And he also says that the main constituents of a satisfied life appear to be 2, either of which by itself is often found sufficient for the purpose: tranquility and excitement. So even if like ultimate happiness isn't attainable, at least these two things, tranquility and excitement, are attainable in some way. So, yeah, that was the first one. He kind of goes on for a while, but also, which I thought was interesting, is that he states basically that Jesus was a utilitarian. He says that in the golden rule of Jesus of Nazareth, we read the complete spirit of the ethics of utility. To do as you would be done by, and to love your neighbor as yourself, constitute the ideal perfection of utilitarian morality. So he says that Jesus had this down. Treat people as you want to be treated, and love your neighbor as yourself, and donezo. That's all you need to do. So, an appeal to authority for sure. And another objection that someone might have is that this standard is too high for humanity, that we can't possibly know, first of all, the effects of our actions to the extent that the utilitarian might think that we do. And secondly, that we're not capable of making those right decisions anyways. And to that, Mill responds that it is the business of ethics to tell us what are our duties, or by what tests we may know them, but no system of ethics requires that the sole motive of all we do shall be a feeling of duty. On the contrary, 99 hundredths of all of our actions are done from other motives, and rightly so done. So, and if the rule of duty does not condemn them. So you don't have to feel good about every decision that you make. Sometimes you just have to do stuff because it's right. And that's what having a moral theory helps us do, is have a principle that applies to all of our actions, and that can help us be good. And another objection that he brings up is that some people think that utilitarianism renders men cold and unsympathizing. And this would be because in the example of like the train, the utilitarian would have to be like, oh, easy, you kill the 1, not the 5. And so, oh, easy, you kill your son, not the 5 people you don't know. That seems very cold, because you're just calculating. You're just saying, okay, 1 is less than 5, easy, done. And so if you do that with every moral problem, that sounds mathematical. It doesn't sound sympathetic. It doesn't sound understanding. But he says that utilitarians are quite aware that a right action does not necessarily indicate a virtuous character, and that actions which are blamable often proceed from qualities entitled to praise. So basically, you can do right things without being a good person. So you can make the right decisions and still not be virtuous, because virtue entails more than that. I think that virtue entails sympathy and kindness and compassion and all of those things. I think he would say the same thing. So this moral theory doesn't render men unsympathetic. It's capable of doing, people are capable of taking anything and twisting them into a way that is bad. Now, and so that's kind of his response, is just utilitarianism isn't really the problem here. It would be any standard of morality at all, because you're applying one principle to hard situations. And so that can look hard cold, and unsympathizing in any way, would be his response. You could definitely still object to that, and if you come up with, or you find a theory that doesn't have that problem, then that would be a good counterexample you could bring up. Okay, then this will be the last objection that we talk about. Some people suggest that there is not enough time to calculate the effects of every action that you make. So, like, if I'm the train guy and I'm trying to choose, I don't have enough time. I'm like, I got 1 second to make the decision, and I see my son or the 5 people. I mean, intuitively, I'm not going to kill my son, and so I don't have the time to process that. And in most moral decisions, you don't have that much time to process things. So Mill's response is that this is exactly as if anyone were to say that it is impossible to guide our conduct by Christianity because there is not time on every occasion on which anything has to be done to read through the Old and New Testaments. The answer to the objection is that there has been ample time, namely the whole past duration of the human species. During all that time, mankind have been learning by experience the tendencies of actions on which experience, all the prudence, as well as all the morality of life are dependent. So, mankind must by this time have acquired positive beliefs as to the effects of some actions on their happiness. So basically, your whole life has been kind of training you in a sense. I think maybe if you think about if you have this theory from a young age, you get into a rhythm of it becoming natural. And, if the human species has been thinking this way, then, other people will, and you just it keeps becoming faster. Let's see, for example, I used to really have to think about 2 + 3 = 5 whenever I was in kindergarten or whatever. It took me a minute. Now, I do a lot of things based on the fact that 2 + 3 = 5. Just in every day, you leave a tip or whatever. That basic principle is in my mind somewhere, and it's acting automatically now. And so for morality, the more you're in the rhythm of doing that, as with anything, the more automatic it becomes, the less time it takes. And also, it's the same as any other moral theory, because moral problems just require time, typically. Not all. I mean, if you have like the option to, I don't know. Never mind. I thought I had a quick example, but I don't. Yeah, so he says, though the application of the standard may be difficult, it's still better than no standard at all. And any standard would have these same problems. So that's pretty much all of Mill. If you have any questions, please tell me. Kant was before Mill. He was like right before Mill. Like 2 years after Kant died, Mill was born. So Kant is from 1700s, 1724 to 1804. German. That's why he's so hard to read. He was a philosopher of the Enlightenment, and he has writings on all types of philosophy. Ethics, political philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of mind, aesthetics, philosophy of religion. I mean, it's ridiculous. And everything that he writes is too long. So he has so many things, and he writes too much. So he has a lot to say. And it's kind of hard to read him if you had more trouble with him, I totally understand, because that just is who he is. He comes up with a bunch of words and then, defines them and stuff. So sometimes it's hard to keep a running tally of all the definitions that he's made up. But we'll see what we can do. I'm going to try and simplify his more than he has. So he starts out with this paper the same way that Mill started out with his. Basically, that there has to be a concept of morality for all. So, unless one wants to refuse the concept of morality, all truth in reference to some possible object, one cannot deny that its law is so extensive in its significance that it must hold not merely for human beings, but for all rational beings as such, not merely under contingent conditions and with exceptions, but with absolute necessity. Ooh, sorry about that. So, yeah, he's also, one thing that he's trying to do is show that a moral law is a priori. So you can't find a moral law in nature, and you can't find it from experience. It's something that is placed in our minds, that we have and we learn from reason alone. So everything in nature works according to laws, according to Kant. So only a rational being only a rational being has the capacity to act according to the representation of laws, according to principles or a will. So, what he means by this is that there are laws of nature everywhere, and things like plants, or I don't know, bacteria, all fall in line with particular laws of nature, but they're not willing to do so. There's no will where they will that they would follow the principle, they just do. So there's no rational thinking that's happening. It's just by nature. So for human beings, we have a law, a moral law, that, according to Kant, that we will to follow or will not to follow. So we have the choice. Our will plays a huge part. And it's because we are rational agents. So since reason is required for deriving actions from laws, the will is nothing other than practical reason. So our willing to do something is simply practical reason. It's still a version of reason. It's just more pragmatic. All right, so he uses the word imperative a lot, and you have the hypothetical imperative or the categorical imperative. And imperative just refers to the form. Let's see. Yeah, the formula. Okay, first I should say, we should define command. The representation of an objective principle, insofar as it is necessitating for a will, is called a command. And then the formula of the command is called imperative. So we'll be talking about imperative more so than command. So all imperatives are either hypothetical or categorical. So if an action would be good merely as a means to something else, the imperative is hypothetical. If the action is represented as good in itself, it's categorical. See what I mean by he just be making up stuff all the time? It ends up being good. He's very smart. It's just not my style. So the categorical concerns not the matter of an action or what is to result from it, but the form and the principle from which it does itself follow. So the categorical imperative is universal. Okay, so it says there is therefore only a single categorical imperative, and it is this: act only according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So only act according to a maxim that could be a universal law. So another way to say that, and this is also called the universal imperative of duty. So act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature. So before we move on, we should think of an example to make this make sense to us. So he actually gives this example, someone stealing. Maybe I should just use that one. Okay, so imagine someone really needs money, and so they want to borrow money from, so let's say his parents. And he knows that he's not going to be able to repay them, but also he knows that he's not going to get the money if he doesn't tell them, oh yeah, I'm just borrowing it. So, is it okay for him to say, can I just borrow this money and I'll pay you back, knowing full well that he will not pay them back? Well, we should think about this action as a maxim. So the maxim that he would be operating under would be, when I believe myself to be in need of money, I shall borrow money and promise to repay it, even though I know that it will never happen. So that is the maxim that he's operating under. So now, let's go back to the categorical imperative. Imagine if that maxim were to become a universal law of nature. So the maxim, when I believe myself to be in need of money, I shall borrow money and promise to repay it, even though I know that it will never happen. Let's imagine that is now a universal law. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? That's a bad thing. Bad thing. We don't want that. And not only is it bad, it's impossible. You couldn't do that. People could not. That couldn't be a maxim. Because first of all, you would run out of things eventually. You would run out of money in general because you would have all these people saying, yeah, I will. I'll just take this and then I'll just pay you right back. No big deal. Eventually, nobody has any money anymore. Also, you're treating that person that you're borrowing money from as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. You're treating them as the way that you get money, not as a rational human being that has value and worth, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So for every circumstance that you can think of that has, a moral question to it, you must consider whether the maxim that you operate under can become a universal law. And if it can't, then you should not do it. That's not good. So he gives another example of imagine someone has all these talents and they choose not to cultivate their talents because he doesn't want to. So he's just neglecting his natural gifts. So if this becomes this maxim of neglecting your own talents and gifts becomes a universal law by nature, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? That is also a bad thing. So you do not want to do that. And then basically there would be no enjoyment to life at that point. No one would be operating under their gifts. You would not have comedians to make you laugh. You would not have doctors to make you feel better. You would not have philosophers to make you think. You would not have baristas to make you coffee. All of the above. People would not be doing things. So he says that as a rational being, he necessarily wills that all capacities in him be developed because they serve him and are given to him for all sorts of possible purposes. So, simply put, the categorical imperative is Kant's huge thing, that it is an action is right if the maxim can become a universal law. That's it. Okay. I've been sitting too long. So he says, not only must the maxim be thought to become a universal law, one must be able to will that a maxim of our action become a universal law. This is, as such, the canon of judging it morally. Some actions are such that their maxim cannot even be thought without contradiction as a universal law of nature, let alone that one could will that it should become such. So, you need to be able to will that it become a universal law. So it cannot have a contradiction in it. Okay, so he says that duty is to be practical, unconditional necessity of action. It must thus hold for all rational beings to which an imperative can at all apply, and only in virtue of this law also for every human will. Yeah, it must also, it just has to be the case for all rational human beings, or rational beings. I shouldn't say human. There can be other rational beings. Okay, so now we get to, means versus ends. So, I think that often we treat other people as means to an end rather than ends in themselves. So it's good to be reminded that this is the part of Kant that I appreciate, pointing out that other rational beings are ends in themselves, that they're not just a means to get what you want, and when you treat them as such, you're acting morally wrong. So a human being, and generally every rational being, exists as an end in itself, not merely as a means for the discretionary use for this or that will, but must in all its actions, whether directed towards itself or also to other rational beings, always be considered at the same time as an end. He points out that non-rational beings are called things and rational beings are called persons, and that's significant because things can be means, but persons are always ends. So, a rational nature exists as an end in itself. I think that's, So he says the practical imperative will thus be the following. So so we have the categorical imperative, universal law. Then we have the practical imperative, which is act that you use humanity in your own person as well as in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. So he gives a few examples. One, he talks about suicide, which I think is interesting. He says that whenever someone is contemplating self-murder or suicide, they're viewing themselves as a means to an end and not as an end in themselves. They're viewing themselves as a means to ending a horrible life. And that's hard. It's hard to say that is morally wrong when things are really hard for people. But I think when you approach it as though, like, I don't know. I mean, this is hard because there's so many complex feelings on it, but I think treating yourself as an end in itself is important, and basically, what I'm trying to say is that your life has value because of who you are, and so trying to end that, once again, it's hard for me to say that it's wrong because I don't want you to hear me and think I'm saying something that I'm not. So anyways, let me go back to Kant. Kant would say that it's wrong, and I'm just trying to be extra sensitive because it's a sensitive topic, so that's why I'm acting weird. But I do think it's important to see yourself as an end in yourself, is the point. So there's actually a lot of philosophy on suicide. It's very interesting. If you're interested in that sort of thing, well, in that, reading about it. Okay. Anyways, on to less stressful things. All right. He also says that the natural end that all human beings have is their own happiness. So that's kind of similar to Mill in a sense, but we're still obviously getting to different conclusions. So he says the third practical principle of the will is the supreme condition of its harmony with universal practical reason. Sorry, I missed one. That with regard to meritorious duty to oneself, it is not enough that the action not conflict with humanity in our person as an end in itself, it must also harmonize with it. So then, let's see, the supreme condition of its harmony with universal practical reason, the idea of the will of every rational being as a universally legislating will. Then he gets to his final little doctrine in this piece, which is a kingdom of ends. So the goal is a kingdom of ends. By kingdom, he means the systematic union of several rational beings through common laws. So you want imagine like an island where everyone agrees to all this stuff. That would be a great kingdom of ends. So he says, now, since laws determine ends according to their universal validity, it is possible, if one abstracts from the personal differences among rational beings, and likewise from all content of their private ends, to conceive a whole of all ends in systematic connection. So that would be his kingdom of ends. You want everyone to act according to these principles that he's come up with, or it's not going to work. So, yeah. Kant is complicated, but if you remember categorical imperative and means versus ends, you'll be good to go. This one went a little longer than I have been just because I didn't do one at the beginning of the week. So that is why. But if you have any questions, let me know. Let me know if you need anything. We're nearing the end of the semester, so that is awesome. So keep trucking. See you later.